Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Daniel Roth and I'm a Senior Program Manager at Microsoft. And today we're going to talk about everything new in MVC and Web API. Specifically, it's very exciting, we're going to be talking about MVC 6. But in addition to MVC 6, we'll talk about stuff that's shipping now, MVC 5.2, Web API 2.2, but we'll give a preview of the stuff that we're planning to do for MVC 6. So what is MVC 6 all about? Well, let's look at the state of the world today. Today we have various frameworks built on top of ASP.NET. We have web pages, a lightweight framework for building web UI, very simple, very quick, just create a bunch of pages and you're good to go. We have MVC, which is great for building out for larger applications with more structure, great for testing. And then you have Web API, which is great for doing web services, web APIs where you want to target a variety of clients, browsers, mobile devices, and so forth. And these things are similar, but different. You know, they have parts that are common and in places where they diverge. Some places where they diverge is for good technical reasons. They target different scenarios and so they do different things. But in other places where they diverge, it's mostly for historic reasons. With web pages in MVC, they are common in that they both use Razor as their underlying syntax for building views, for building pages. But then they diverge in terms of the set of HTML helpers that they use once you're actually creating your Razor page. With MVC and Web API, they have a lot of concepts that are similar. You create controllers, you create actions, but they're all there's no sharing of any implementation. The types are completely different. You have controllers in Web API, an API controller, and controllers in MVC. You have actions in Web API, actions in MVC, filters, model binding, and so forth. They're very conceptually similar, but in terms of implementation, they're actually completely decoupled. Actually, Web API and MVC share no code at all. And that is purely for historic reasons. In MVC, that's a framework that came first. It was a framework that was built on top of ASP.NET, tightly tied to the ASP.NET pipeline, HTTP context, and so forth. And so really, MVC only runs inside of IIS, inside of the ASP.NET pipeline. Web API came a little bit later, and it came from a services background, and we knew when we built Web API that we wanted to be able to support scenarios like self-hosting. We wanted to leverage the new modern HTTP programming model from the new HTTP client in .NET 4.5, and so they really couldn't be the same, but we wanted a lot of the concepts to be familiar, to be similar. You know, their controllers, their actions, and so what you ended up with was duplication. You ended up with two different variants of filters, controllers, and actions. And while that meant things felt familiar, it meant you couldn't reuse components in a way that you might like to do. Like you'd like to be able to implement one filter that you could use in MVC and also use in Web API. It also impacts us as Microsoft and as the product team, where we want to deliver more features to you, but every time we do a feature for MVC and Web API that really makes sense in both worlds, that means we have to do the same feature twice. A good example would be attribute routing. Attribute routing was a feature that we added in Web API 2 and MVC 5. Attribute routing is useful for both doing Web UI and Web API scenarios, but we basically had to do two separate implementations, attribute routing for Web API and attribute routing for MVC. This, of course, has extra costs and extra burden on us, which means we deliver less features to you. We'd like to get to a place where instead of having these differences that are really unnecessary, duplication, we can unify on one framework and be able to give you a consistent and not confusing programming model while at the same time allowing us to deliver more features to you. So that's why with MVC 6, we're taking a big step to merge these frameworks. MVC 6 is the next version of MVC, of course, but it's also the next version of Web API. Like Web API 3, you should think of as that's going to be MVC 6. Web Pages 4, that's going to be MVC 6. The next version of these frameworks are all going to be aligned into a single framework, and all the things that should be common will be. There'll be one model for controllers, one model for doing model binding, routing, validation, and so forth. So dependency injection, all these things will be done in a common way, so it's easier for you and also enables us to add more features into the framework itself. So what are you going to get with ASP.NET MVC 6? You're going to get, first of all, one set of concepts. Remove the duplication. Where things should be shared, they will be. It will be a framework that can do both web UI. You can have controllers that return views, that rendering HTML, and it can also do web APIs. Those same controllers can also return formatted data, JSON, XML, so forth. Full support for content negotiation, all the features you're familiar with web API. It'll also have a nice smooth transition from web pages to MVC. Maybe you start out building a very simple application that's just a bunch of pages, and so you just go ahead and use web pages, create a bunch of HTML files, go ahead and put the code in line, no problem with that. You're just trying to do something light and quick. But then maybe that application grows and becomes more popular, and now you really need to scale it out. You got more people working on the project. Wouldn't it be great if that application could smoothly transition into a full-on MVC application where you have more structure, more componentization, separation of concerns. You now have controllers and views. You can more easily unit test your controllers. You have features like areas, so you can separate things out, different parts of your app, so different teams can work on different things. One of the ideas that we're working with in MVC6 is imagine an ASP.NET Web Pages app is basically just an MVC app with like auto controllers, and then you have a way to go ahead and take the code for those controllers and spit them to disk, make them real. Everything we're doing in MVC6 is being built DI first. So today in MVC we have a dependency resolver, and there's a set of implementations of that dependency resolver to work with all your favorite IOC containers, autofact, inject, and so forth. Web API has its own abstraction for dependency resolution, and of course you have to have your separate set of components for integrating with your favorite IOC containers. In this new world, in MVC6, there is a central DI concept that everybody can leverage, everybody uses. It's not everybody has its own separate DI framework. Instead, there's one DI framework, DI abstraction that the frameworks leverage. And we provide a simple default DI implementation that you can use, but it's minimalistic. It's just intended to get the system bootstrapped. You can, of course, pop it out, put in your favorite one that's fully featured and does everything that you like to do with IOC. Now, I see we got a question from the audience. What is the preferred upgrade path from MVC 5.1 to 6? It's a great question. Migration from MVC 5 and your Web API 2 and Web Pages applications to MVC 6 is something that we care very deeply about. We'll talk a little bit about some of the, this is a major version. MVC 6 is going to bring changes. We're built on top of a new pipeline. This is part of ASP.NET vNext, which we'll show in a bit, some of the really cool, mind-blowing things that we're doing in ASP.NET vNext. So there will be changes, there will be breaking changes. But at the same time, this is just the next version of each of these frameworks. So we're working very hard to try and make the programming models, the code that you write, look the same. Like you're still writing an MVC controller, which returns action results and does model binding and all those things. You're still writing, Web API controllers that do content negotiation and those things. We're trying to make the things that really should stay the same. There's no reason to change them. Let them stay the same. So a lot of your code can just be recompiled for MVC6. Now I don't want to give the impression that there's not going to be like binary compatibility where you can just update a NuGet package to MVC6 and your app magically works. This is we're revving the major version with good reason, because there will be changes. It's a new ASP.NET pipeline that we're sitting on top of. MVC6 is built on the new request pipeline that comes in ASP.NET vNext. It doesn't run on IHP modules and HP handlers. It runs on the new middleware pipeline that comes with ASP.NET vNext. So you're dealing with a newer, lightweight HP context, not the existing HP context. So there's underlying core changes that are going to happen that you'll have to to migrate from one to the other. But we're trying to keep as much the same, so it still is the frameworks that you know and love. Hopefully that answers that question. Because MVC6 is built on top of the new request pipeline in ASP.NET vNext, it can support things like being self-hosted outside of IIS. You don't have to have IIS in the box at all. You can do Web UI and Web APIs like you always could in the past. This is great. You may have environments where in the past, well, even today, you didn't have the option of really deploying IIS into that environment. Maybe you're an ISV and you're trying to sell to customers, and to ask them to enable IIS in their environments is a little too heavyweight. Or maybe you just have an environment where turning on IIS just isn't an option. I remember talking to a customer once where they basically wanted to deploy a web app to an oil rig, and the only machines they had on this oil rig were client boxes. So they had to do a self-hosted story without IIS. These things will be now possible with MVC 6 for both UI and APIs. Now, that said, IS still our preferred web host of choice. It gives you a lot of great management features that you're not going to get when you're self-hosted, but at least now you'll have that option of being fully self-hosted. All right, one more question. How would you keep authentication mechanisms different for MVC versus APIs, like forms auth for MVC, tokens for API? That's a great question. We haven't actually even gotten to the point yet where we've migrated token-based authentication to the new stack. So honestly, still to be determined. Today we use mechanisms where you can have you can use different authentication filters depending on different scopes or different controllers, maybe something like that, but it's still a little early. I don't think we have a great answer for that yet. We are pushing all of the authentication logic into middleware, as we've been doing with the Katana Owen story. Like today, we have middleware in Katana. That was sort of the first step in terms of getting our the middleware pieces in ASP.NET to be independent of system web. You can run them self-hosted. You can run them inside of IIS. We're migrating those over onto the ASP NET VNext stack. So we've already done the cookie middleware, for example, the authorization server middleware, the bearer token middleware. That's going to come over too. How does the new pipeline relate to Owen? Wow, these are great questions. I'm going to take one more and I'm going to move on because I got a bunch of content I want to get to. The new pipeline has a new middleware model. It will support Owen middleware. One thing that we did make a change is that the new middleware model, in and of it's not directly exposing Owen in your face, kind of like Katana did. Katana basically said there's Owen and then there's basically Owen, only Owen. And when you're writing middleware, you're dealing with lots of funcs and the lightweight dictionary. It was experiment in terms of what it would be like to expose Owen directly to you. We found that experience to be a bit raw. Writing middleware against that model was a bit difficult. So what we've done is we've created a model where we can take middleware that is built against the Owen contract and we can run that inside the ASP.NET pipeline, but the actual programming model that you deal with is more like an HTTP context style programming model. All right, let's keep on moving. MVC 6 based on the new pipeline, and it also runs on the new cloud optimized runtime. And what does that mean? In ASP NET VNext, there's the existing desktop framework that you can run on that, and you can use the new pipeline on top of the existing desktop framework. So all your binaries that you use today, they work, and that's all great. But there's also a new cloud optimized runtime, which is a version of .NET that has been slimmed down and highly factored. Like imagine you take the base class libraries in the .NET framework and you break them all apart as decoupled NuGet packages. And you can just grab the pieces that you need into your application, and even the CLR itself. And you can then deploy these pieces with your application into your environment. So if you have an environment, that like only has like .NET, 2 on it or something like that, and you want it, but you still want to be able to run on the latest, greatest frameworks. With the cloud optimized runtime, you have the ability to do that. You have a very lean, mean, fast runtime where you take the pieces that you need into your app and you can deploy it onto an environment and run it truly side by side with other versions of the cloud optimized runtime. This is the first time for .NET we're having a true side-by-side story for .NET applications. So MVC will be able to run on top of that runtime. Now, to run into top of that runtime, that means being able to, you need to live within certain constraints. In order to enable that level of factoring, .NET today has its own set of spaghetti dependency problems. To break the dependencies and allow things to be decoupled, the API surface area of .NET had to be modernized. So you need to be able to compile against the modern API contracts for the cloud optimized runtime. So there's some constraints that you have to deal with if you want to run it on the cloud optimized runtime. MVC 6 conforms with those constraints, and if you do too, you can then take advantage of that full side-by-side, great perf, and so forth. All right. Let's move on. So there's a quick question about the ASP NET VNext stuff and the cloud optimized runtime. Is MVC 6 Project K VNext only? And the answer is yes. So the MVC 6 frameworks is taking a dependency on the new request pipeline that's coming with ASP NET VNext. It can run on both the desktop framework or the cloud optimized runtime, but it is built on top of the new pipeline. So that means, if you have an HTTP module that you want to run with your application. Well, you probably want to stick with the existing system web ASP.NET story for that case, and which is fine. It's totally supported. As you just saw in the previous talk, Web forms is what runs on the system web pipeline as well. We're doing lots of investments in that space. So if that's the world you're in, you want to use the existing ASP.NET pipeline. That MVC5, Web API 2, Web Pages 3, those are all built against that pipeline. MVC 6, though, is moving on to the new pipeline, so you can take advantage of all the lightweight, componentized world. So that's the story there. Okay, how do you get started with MVC 6? Because everything I'm doing here, you could do too. This is unprecedented openness, honestly, with the whole ASP.NET stack up and down. We're open source from the beginning of this effort. We're taking contributions. You can get really early previews of the bits and the tooling with the bits. There's a great new modern tooling. By the way, for ASP.NET VNext in general, I'm gonna be kind of high level talking about ASP.NET VNext. If you want the deep dive, you should tune in to David Fowler and Damian Edwards' talk later today, where they're going to do a full deep dive into ASP.NET VNext. In this talk, we'll just talk about it lightly. But the tooling is available with the Visual Studio 14 CTP. You can download that and install that today. You can find docs and samples for the stuff that I'm going to show you on our ASP.NET site, asp.net/vnext. And there's included, for example, a full MVC Music Store sample implementation based off of MVC 6 that's available on GitHub that you can take a look at. You can also just get the code. If you want to just look at the code, you can find that on GitHub at github.com/aspnet/MVC. That's where the MVC repository is. And there's a bunch of other repositories that are related to it, like the Razor repository and so forth. And you can, of course, try out a nightly build. If you want to try out the latest stuff hot off the press, there's instructions on how to do that in the wiki on the home repository. So that's github.com/aspnet/home. You can find instructions on how to get started there. Whew, lots of talk. Let's see it. Let's do it. Okay, I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. This is Visual Studio 14, and let's create a new MV6 application. So in File, New Project. So this is the Visual Studio that you can download and install yourself, Visual Studio 14, the CTP. And if I look at the web node, you'll see there's some new things here. Here's the ASP.NET Web App template that you're familiar with and you know and love, and that will then pop up the one ASP.NET dialog, and you can pick web forms or MVC and so forth. But there's also these new templates that are sitting currently side by side with it. This is a temporary thing, and the name's subject to change. We probably won't be calling this ASP.NET VNext by the time we ship. Otherwise, we'd have to call the next version, ASP.NET VNext, and that would be silly. So the names will change. Also, the location of these templates will probably change as well. We believe in the one ASP.NET vision. These templates will probably find their way into the one ASP.NET dialog, so you can pick and choose which type of application you want to create. But for now, they're available as siblings. Let's see what kinds of templates we have. There's an empty web app, so that's should be obvious. It's just an empty app. There's a full web application template. So this has things like Bootstrap enabled, ASP.NET identity is set up, so you can log in, register users, and so forth. There's a class library, and the class library. Why is there a special class library for ASP.NET VNext? Well, this is a class library that's going to plug into the new ASP.NET VNext loader mechanism, and we'll show you that in a bit. So there's some new experiences that will enable very agile development flows inside of the ASP.NET VNext tooling. And then even weirder is that there's a console application. Why is there a console application sitting inside the web node? Well, remember we said that ASP.NET VNext can be self-hosted outside of IIS, or it can be hosted in your own process. So the way you can think about this console app template is it's like a simple little self-host project template. And the name's probably a little weird. It's also a really easy way to sort of get started playing around with the new CLR host and the runtime. Like if you just want to do Hello World, console app is a simple way to do that. This is the template that you can use to get up and running with just an exe basically. Okay, but let's create a web app. So let's call this my first MVC 6 app. Okay, and I think this is still my first. Yes, great. All right, so this is going to create the new project template. And there should be a lot of stuff here that looks really familiar. I see controllers. Here's my home controller. That looks familiar. It derives from controller. That looks fine. Returning action results, index about contact. That's all cool. I've got my model types in here for this is apparently the models for wiring up ASP.NET identity. That's all fine. Here are my views. My home view, index, contact, about. Nothing too surprising there. This is just CSHTML. So that looks great. So that's very intentional. Remember, this is just the next version of MVC. There are some things here that are new, that are really cool, blow your mind, but I want to make sure you realize that this is still MVC. The stuff that you know carries forward. Now, some of the things that you notice from just scanning this list that appear new, well, first of all, there's this config.json file. Well, what's that? Well, in ASP NET MVC, we've created a new config system. Remember, we talked about the cloud optimized runtime. A big focus of ASP NET MVC is the ability to move really seamlessly from on-premise to the cloud. The cloud optimized runtime actually doesn't have to run in the cloud. You can run it on-premise too. The name's kind of confusing that way, but it's definitely designed with the cloud in mind up front as opposed to an afterthought. Problems that you probably have today with the cloud is you configure a bunch of stuff locally, it works great. And then you deploy it to the cloud and things blow up because you got to configure them specifically for that environment. One of the things we're doing in ASP NET MVC is giving you an environment-based config system. So this config.json file is a source of name value pairs that the new environment-based config system can just pick up. I'll show you that in a second. There's this project.json file. That's new. What is that thing? This is where you manage all of your dependencies for your ASP.NET VNext app. There's a new CLR host for ASP.NET VNext that knows how to load a dependency in a variety of ways using a set of providers. Most of the time in ASP.NET VNext, your dependencies are going to be NuGet packages. But they could also be just a directory full of code that maybe you clone from a Git repository for an open source project on the internet. That's totally fine. So here you can see in the project.json file, I see my dependencies, and they're really simple. They're just a name and a version, and then those set of providers go and figure out how do I get this thing? Is there a NuGet package in my packages folder? Okay, great. Or is there? Oh, there's a directory here with that name. That looks great too. So if we look at the file explorer for this application. And we go up one. See, there's the packages folder that has all the NuGet packages that are being used by this app. Now, nice thing about the tooling for ASP.NET VNext is that the references node has been lit up with a lot of interesting functionality. Here it's saying, oh, I'm using .NET 4.5.1 in this case. So this is an ASP.NET VNext app based on the existing desktop frameworks, not using cloud optimized, not yet. We'll get there. But if I expand this, look, there's all my dependencies that I can then browse through the dependency graph. Like if I look at ASP NET MVC, I can see, oh yeah, and it depends on Razor, of course, and Razor depends on a whole bunch of other stuff. So you have the whole dependency tree available right in front of you through the references node. So that's pretty cool. Now the startup file, hopefully that looks kind of familiar. If you've been playing around with Project Katana, in middleware, you probably know, oh, startup, that's probably where I set up my middleware pipeline for my application. That's where I configure anything that I want to use in my application. So let's go take a look at what's in startup.cs. A whole bunch of things, like browser. Actually, before we even get there, let's see what the app does. Then that'll help us understand what's in the pipeline. I didn't want to start with debugging. Let me stop that, and let me stop debugging. Don't want to start with debugging because I want to show some of the new tooling features. Okay, so I'm going to just do Control F5. I get a 500 server error. That's not right. So these are new tooling. So you are seeing excitement live. Let's see if we can figure out what's wrong. The build errors will give me a clue. It says it's working. Okay, let me start. I don't want you to load that. Let me go to another project real fast. Crash! Woo! Yeah, so you can tell this is early. Stuff is new. It's a little hot. All right, let me try one more time. I'm not sure what was going on there. Let me go to one sample. Just make sure that I'm getting. I want to pull up IE just to make sure I'm seeing that instead of Chrome. Maybe I don't know if that's causing the problem. And let me go back to my first ASP.NET web app. Okay. All right, that looks good. Start up CS, sure, everything's loaded. Let's run this guy in use. All right, let's close this. Make sure there's no IIS running. It's not. last time, and then I'll jump to a backup app. Wow, no idea why that's not working. Okay, let me jump out to a backup app. So open. I think I have a backup. Yeah. Let's see if this guy's going to work for me. The same app. And drum roll. Okay, great. Whew. All right, so I don't quite know what's different. Literally, this app is the same experience, a file new project, but okay, whatever. So this is the template experience that you get by default when you file new ASP.NET VNext new web app, and it looks pretty similar to the web app experience you probably have seen with the existing web app experience in like Visual Studio 2013 and so forth. But so I can let's register. Actually, I think I've already registered a new user, but I can create another one if I want. Let's create Dan Roth 28 in this app, and I can using ASP NET identity to actually register this user, and my little tool is great. So I'm gonna have to, the password checker forces really strong passwords. So I actually generally use a tool to create my password, but it's not letting me. So let me just create a bunch of, I don't know, random characters. Let's do da 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 da. There, how about that? So my very strong, long password. Register. All right, great. Must have see, I didn't even with my random characters, I didn't get enough characters in there. Let's try to get da da da. So some capitals, some weird this and that. All right, how about that? Okay, create a new user. I can log off. I can log in. You know, Dan Roth 28, and using the same passwords before, so forth. So, and there's an about page and a contact page, everything that you know and love from the simple starter template. Okay, now let's go look at that startup class and see what's there. Let me jump back here. Okay, so startup. Let me collapse a few things just to make things simpler. All right. So first of all, I want you to notice that this is where everything in my application is configured. If it's not here, it's not on my app. And one thing that's not here is system web. There's no system web in this application at all. And so if you want some middleware-like functionality like static files or cookie-based logins, you have to actually add it to your application. And if you want to take everything out and have bare metal performance, that's available to you through this model. So let's take a look at what the template gives you by default. So first, it enables browser link. So that enables you to edit stuff in the browser, and that edits your code. Here's the new config system I mentioned before, the environment-based config system. This has got a set of config providers that can pull name value pairs from a variety of places. It's pulling from that JSON file that I showed you previously. That's where it's getting the connection string. But it also will pull values from environment variables. So you can go to your production system, configure a value for your production environment, develop locally with a set of values that make sense for development, deploy into production, and the config system will just automatically pick up the value from the environment. So that's pretty nice. Use services. What is this? Remember we talked about everything we're doing in MVC 6 is DI first. So here's where you configure the services that you want your application to use. This is where you set up DI. So it's setting up the services for Entity Framework. It's configuring the DB context that's going to be injected into the controllers. It's setting up ASP.NET Identity. And then lastly, of course, not least, setting up the services for MVC. And MVC has a whole variety of services. You can go in and rip them out and replace them with different ones that suit your needs. Okay? Setting up static file middleware so we can serve up JavaScript files and so forth. Setting up cookie authentication. And then lastly, actually setting up MVC, use MVC. Now if we look at use MVC, right in here you can see it's setting up the routing middleware. So there's a routing middleware implementation for ASP.NET VNext, and you can see it's setting up a route for both MVC style actions and also for web APIs. That's because in MVC 6 you can do web APIs, you can do web UI, both are just fine. Okay, so that's what's happening in the application. Now this is everything in the kitchen sink, just to prove that you know, you don't need to have all this to get up and running. Let's do something simple. I'm just going to comment out everything in this configure file. Boop. All right, great. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save, go back to the browser, and Control F, and just F5 the browser, refresh it. And what this is doing is that in ASP NET VNext, the loaders will on the fly recompile the application using Roslyn. So I don't actually have to do an explicit build step, wait for it to build, look at the errors, go to the browser, F5 to see the changes. In MVC 6 with ASP NET VNext, you can just modify your controller code, save F5, modify, save F5. So you get that really fast, agile workflow that maybe you're familiar with for more interpreted style languages like Node or Ruby, but now it's available to you in a strongly typed C# based language. Now you notice I got a 404. Well, that's expected, right? I commented everything out of my application. Let's go add something back. Let's do like app.use welcome page. So here's this is a little package that maybe you saw in the Katana projects. It's basically the same implementation, but done for ASP NET VNext. It's a little page that lets you know your server is running. So I'm going to do welcome page, save. Let's go back over here and just F5, save and F5. That's the flow. And if that worked, then I should see a little simple welcome page to let me know that things are working. Ding! Yeah, so I got a running server. Oh, I see we got a question. With the new .json config files, does it still use MS-build? So well, first of all, the config files that's a configuration system, so that doesn't really have anything to do with build. That's really about configuring values for your application at runtime. I think you're referring to like project.json. Project.json itself is not based off of MS-build, but you can still compose with MS-build logic. Like if you have MS-build tasks that you want to use, that's fine. I mean, this is still a solution. It's still got there's a kproj instead of a csproj. There's a kproj file where you can wire up your csproj tasks. And then this next question was, when will MVC 6 be available for production? It's really early, actually. Like, we're giving you a view of MV6 really early in development. That's because we want you to participate with us, give us feedback. Tentatively looking at like Q1 of 2015, but that's a ways out. Sometime in a year or so. All right, great. So we can see that the app's now running. That was pretty easy. Now let's do something a little bit more custom. I want to actually, let's do like an IHP handler style scenario, but on ASP NET VNext, just to give you a feel of how this works. So I'm going to do a little run call here, and it's going to be async, because everything we're doing here is async. It's going to handle the request, and then I'm going to take the request, and I'm just going to write to the response. And I don't know, ASP.NET VNext rocks. What about that? Okay. Save, go over the browser. Where'd my browser go? Oh, I closed it. Sorry. Shouldn't have done that. Let me Control F5 again then. Oh, and I forgot to await. It's all right. I'll find out about that soon enough. I'm just going to save. Nope. Control F5 again. Oh, it's still build errors. Response. Oh, it's probably response async, isn't it? No. Oh, write async. There we go. Let the browser come up. Normally I just leave the browser up and you can just refresh it. But I accidentally closed it for some reason. And I should see just some text that gets written out from the server. There it is. Cool. Okay, so that's working. Now, how do project references work in this world? You see, I've already added one of those ASP NET VNext web class libraries. So I just added it to my project. It also has a project.json file which expresses its set of dependencies, and it has just a simple class, and it's a static class that has a get message method for returning a string. And in my start file, I can go ahead and consume that. Oh, how did I actually add that dependency? If I look at my project.json, look, there it is. And if I remove this, let me go ahead and remove this. Play with fire here a little bit. Let me add it back now. You'll notice that one of the nice things about this project.json file is you get IntelliSense for NuGet packages, for project references. Look, there's my project, and I need a version number. Well, it's just code, so I don't actually need to provide a version number. In this case, the ASP.NET VNext loaders are just going to find that code and compile it on the fly, save, and we're good to go. Now if I go back to startup, I'm going to consume that class library. Instead of having a static string, let's do class. Oh, is it still not? Oh, there it is, class library 1, class 1, get message. And there, now I'm actually calling into a dependent project. So we go back to this window. I should see something slightly different now. This text from the class library. Compiling everything on the fly. There it is, ASP NET MVC 6 for the win. Okay, cool. So that's to give a feel of how the development flow here works. You just you edit, you save, you F5. You can have as little as you want or as much as you want in the pipeline. In this case, you're talking like bare metal performance, or you can have all of MVC and get all the productivity of using those type of high level frameworks. So let me delete this and go back to MVC and show that the same things work even when you're using a full framework, not just for these simple hello world like scenarios. Go back to my code and uncomment it. Okay, save. And if I go look at my controller, here's a home controller. You'll notice that the about page for the home controller is using that class library already, and that was like ASP NET MVC 6 for the win. Let me go change that. Let's go to that page. Let's go to. So I've already re-enabled MVC by uncommenting all that code, so I should see an MVC view again. There it is, and it's very big. All right, and now let's go to About. Okay, MVC 6 for the win. That's the text from before. That looks good. Let me change this text. I don't know. It's cool. Save. I'm going to go here, F5. So this is, I edited a file in a dependent project that's being used by an MVC controller, and then hopefully it's being, there, yeah, so compiled on the fly. So all I had to do was save an F5 to see those changes. All right, some questions. Does MVC 6 support old school web.config files? So the new config system that we have a bunch of providers we've already wired up, like a simple XML provider, a simple JSON provider. We have talked about also adding a simple provider for like web.config files, like reading from the app settings section. I don't know if that's in yet, but it's certainly been discussed. Will you be able to do config transforms like you can with web.config now? It's a great question. With this environment-based config notion, one of the things we're really one of the problems we hope that solves is that you can avoid a lot of the complexity of what you use web.config transforms today for by just having values configured in the specific environment that you care about. So instead of transforming the config file based on where you're going to, just have the right configuration values in the environment already there. The app just picks them up and you're good to go. Does MVC 6 draw more from the Web API way of doing things? I can see that being good in some cases and bad in others. That's a great question. We're trying to merge a bunch of frameworks. MVC, Web API, web pages. In some cases there's duplication, so which one do you keep? We're trying to keep everybody happy. There's obviously cases where you can't have both ways, so you got to pick one. I think a lot of things you've seen here so far look very much like MVC. These are just simple MVC action methods. The Web API stuff honestly is coming up a little bit later. Let me do some Web API stuff and you'll see where we're currently at there. But certainly a lot of discussion on how far do we go one way or the other. Do you want more RESTful style actions? Do you want more MVC style actions? Do you want to be able to do both at the same time? All those things are still up for discussion. It's early, right? We're about a year out. And last one, will you be able to set middleware for specific routes like in Express? It's a great question at the ASP NET VNext middleware layer. I'm going to punt that one to David Fowler and Damian Edwards' talk later today because it's really more a question about the middleware pipeline. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, let's look at some other things like what does Web API look like in this space? So here I have a test controller. This is just another random controller. And a couple things I want you to note. First thing, it doesn't derive from controller. Where is the controller base type? Like, how can does this even work? I don't know. But you do also notice that it's injecting some services into the constructor. So DI first and foremost in MVC 6, so I can inject services. Here's a little, it's a little simple service. I don't know if this service is going to be there when we finally ship, but it's something that we can demo. Action result helper is like a little helper for being able to return common action results. Like I think it's got a content helper method and a JSON helper method. Okay, but how does the no base type controller? What is that all about? Well, in MVC 6, you don't actually have to have a base type. We support POCO, plain old C# object, controllers. And then everything that you need, you can just inject into the controller. The base type that you see over here in this controller, Big C controller, that's just a controller that injects a bunch of common services, sets up a bunch of helper methods in order to enable you to get up and going faster with a programming model that you're familiar with. But you don't have to do that. The whole system is very much more lightweight. You can actually have just a class. In this case, the convention is just a class that ends with controller, and you're good to go. Now, this class also has a couple of methods. It has an MVC style, RPC-like action method, MVC action, return some content. And then it also has a more RESTful style thing, a get. I just want to call get on the test resource and get some data back. Here in this case, it's explicitly returning back JSON. It's early in the framework, so we haven't even done content negotiation yet. We'll get there. For right now, you can return some JSON from your web API. And then here's the model type that's being used to return that resource. And then it's actually going to get serialized using JSON.NET. So if we go back to the application and actually query the test resource, let's see what happens. So test. If I do test MVC action, well, I would expect that will call that MVC action, just return me some content. Let's see, what's it going to return? Oh, yeah, MVC action is what I expect to see. So let's hit enter, and there it is. Okay, so there I called a MVC style action, and that could just as easily return a view. Now, if I do a more RESTful style thing, I'm going to call the test resource and call the get action. I expect to get some JSON. And I'll pop that open and out in Notepad so you can actually see it. And lo and behold, we get some serialized JSON. So views, content, JSON, no problem. You can do any of those style of actions within the same framework. It's DI first, so you can do things like have a Poco controller where everything you need is just injected and then you use it as you need it. All right. So that's that. OK. Now, I mentioned that MVC and ASP NET vNext, MVC 6, supports being self-hosted. This is everything you're seeing here is all based on IIS. It's still running inside of IIS on the desktop CLR, but using the new ASP NET request pipeline. In MVC 6, you can also run it outside of IIS on like a HTTP listener style host in your own process. How do we do that? Well, if we go back to project.json, you'll see there's this command section, and there's this web command. And what this web command says is, use this hosting infrastructure and pass it this parameter that says I want to use this specific server. I'm going to use this web listener server. Web listener is like a new highly performant HTTP listener. And then host the server at this URL at localhost 5000. So I should be able to just run this from the command line. Let me see if I can do that. So cmd. Now to run it from the command line, you got to get introduced to a couple concepts from ASP NET vNext. The first thing is the version manager, which is there's a tool called KVM. Where does K come from? I don't know. K for cool, whatever you want. It's just a letter. The K is a way to refer to ASP NET vNext. So K version manager is what this tool is. If I run that, it'll give me its help context. If I say, you'll notice that some things I can do is I can list the set of ASP NET vNext runtimes that are available on my machine. So KVM list. There. So I've got 3 versions of the runtime currently. Some of them are cloud optimized. Some of them are full .NET based. That's cool. OK. Now I want to select which version of the K runtime I want to use. And I can do that by doing KVM use. And then I could just type out the version that I want to light up, to select. Typing out those long version numbers, it's kind of tedious. So there's actually another feature, which is aliases, where you can set up a simple alias for a version. So I can list the set of aliases that I've got. Okay, there's a default alias set up for this particular version. Let's use that instead. So KVM use default. And what that's going to do is it's going to put some stuff onto the path so that I can use that particular version of the ASP NET vNext runtime. All right, cool. So if I look at KVM list again, you'll see that there's now a little star next to that particular version that I selected. OK, great. Now let me browse to my, my application. I think it's next, yeah. And then projects. And then my first, we're going to go to the backup one since we had problems with the other one. And let's go into the app. So here I am in the app. You can see the project JSON file and all the stuff that we had before. And to run the app, to run that web command that you saw before, I'm going to use a different command line script, which is the K script. OK, so K web. That's all I got to do. And that should then run this application at that specific port using the web listeners. So self-hosted inside this process. Let's see if it works. I expect to see started. Okay, started. Now let me pop up a impartial third-party browser. That looks right. So localhost 5000. And lo and behold, there's our application. Is it really our application? Like, remember I registered that danroth28 user. Oh, I've probably completely lost my password. Do I still have the password? Oh, it's still there on my clipboard. Great. Log in. Can I log in as danroth28? Yes. All right. So there's a self-hosted MVC app. Can I get some JSON out of this thing? Let's see. I don't know why am I. Oh. Having some touch problems. There we go. Yes, and I can get some JSON out of it too. So Web API, MVC, all being self-hosted. Now I want to do one last thing. I know people have a bunch of questions. All right, I'm going to hop over back to the app. Okay, close this. Let me close this to stop the application. And I'm going to switch this app. Actually, this app may have already been switched. Yeah, okay, so this app is currently running, unlike the other one where I started, weren't running on .NET 4.5.1, the full desktop framework. This one's already running on Core framework, which is another name for the cloud optimized runtime. So this app is running on a version of the CLR and the framework that is a componentized set of NuGet packages that you can deploy as one entity and can run side by side with other applications, completely self-contained. You don't have to install anything on the box in order to be able to run this thing, okay? So let me cancel, and what I'm going to do is right-click, publish, and I'm going to publish to the file system, and I'm going to publish to this directory on my desktop. All right? And what that should do is it's going to bundle up everything in my application into like a zip file type thing and just dump it into that directory on the file system. And at that point, it is a fully self-contained application. And let's see, what is it doing? Publishing folders. Okay, done. So let's go look at that folder. There's that folder, and it now has some stuff in it. There's my class library, there's all the packages, and there's this web.cmd file. That's that web command. What does this thing have in it? Let's go ahead and look at it. Let me show you quick. Web.cmd says, go into the packages folder and run this klr exe. That's our CLR host for the cloud optimized runtime. Give it this app base, the www root. Okay, you saw that in the folder structure. There's www root. That's the app base. And then run web. Run the web command. Okay. And we saw that before. So I should now be able to run this fully self-contained application. You could publish this thing to a thumb drive, pop it into someone else's laptop, and run it off of the file system like I'm about to do. Let me go to CD desktop. Next, okay, and do I see it? Yep, I'm going to write web.cmd, and I should see started again. Cool, okay. Now let's open up our third-party impartial browser again. Ah, crazy touch screen stuff going on. But you can see we now have a cloud-optimized version of that application running from a, you can imagine it from a thumb drive that you popped into another machine, so completely self-contained. So that's MVC6, Web UI, Web API, cloud-optimized, running on top of the new pipeline. So a couple things to keep in mind. MVC6 is a longer-term investment. It's a major release. There are breaking changes that will come with MVC6. That's why we've upped the major version number. It's based on the new ASP NET VNext pipeline. We're merging multiple frameworks. That means we have to pick and choose from different things. So there will be changes. We look to you to help us to know if we're making the right trade-offs, making the right changes to lay a platform for the for the next decade. We expect it to ship Q1 2015 roughly. It's early, so it's like predicting the weather a bit on that one. There's still lots to do. If you play with the bits today, you'll notice there's things that aren't there, like you may be familiar with in your existing MVC5 and Web API 2 apps. You may ask, like, where's content negotiation? Where's attribute routing? Well, they're coming. We're working hard on it. You can actually see our full backlog on GitHub or on HuBoard. If you go to huboard.com, which I can't currently do because of my touch problems. Well, huboard.com/ASP.NET, you'll be able to see the full backlog that we're working on. Whoa. So if you're looking for a platform to build on today that has help page and content negotiation, you're going to want to be building on MVC 5.2 or Web API 2.2, which are currently in release candidate and are going to ship RTW within the next week or so. So that's what the frameworks you're going to want to be building on. Lots of stuff coming in those frameworks. In 5.2, this is a mature platform built on the existing ASP.NET pipeline. It has some improvements in attribute routing. There's the new iDirect route provider, so you can take full control of attribute routing. I was going to demo it, but we're out of time, so I'm going to keep moving. And then Web API 2.2, there's the new OData v4 support, where you can build OData v4 services that are side by side with the OData v3 services. Includes a whole bunch of new features for the OData stack, attribute routing for OData, functions, enums, e-tags. What else is there? There's annotations for query limitations. You can do model aliasing, where you can have your types have one set of names and you can project them into a different set of names. Open complex types, full support for dollar format, camel casing, lots of great stuff in the OData v4 stack. Definitely check it out. So if you're looking for stuff to do that you want to build on today, you're going to want to stick with the existing MVC 5.2, Web API 2.2 stack. But in the future, look to MVC 6, and I'll take the last 5-10 minutes for questions. All right, so let's see. We've got edit, save, and the refresh works when you're in debug mode. So that was a question about, like, when I'm doing that, edit the code, save in F5, does that work when I'm debugging? And the answer is no. When you actually have the debugger attached, you can't can't be killing the process and recompiling everything on the fly. So currently only works when you're not in debug mode. Then VS can manage the process and reload things and rebuild the dependencies. Are you making any changes to attribute routing in this release? Most likely, yes. Attribute routing for MVC 5 and Web API 2 was done a bit as honestly as an afterthought. We had already shipped MVC and Web API. They were based off of the ASP.NET routing system, where your routes live down here in the middleware layer, and they went through a controller selector and an action selector to arrive at your actions. And then we had there was actually a contribution from the community for attribute routing from Tim McCall, and we did the attribute routing system. And it's been a bit of a trying to wedge it in there to get it right. With MVC 6, we hope to be able to take a fresh look at attribute routing to make it really more of a first-class system, first-class citizen in the system. So we're definitely looking for areas to improve attribute routing. But at the same time, we want the programming model to feel familiar, your existing controllers that you've written with attribute routes today. We want that mostly to be able to move over unchanged into the new system. So we are it's a trade-off. We're taking into account both sides of the coin. Let's see. Are the new project.json config files optional? i.e., can we use web.config files in an MVC6 site? So separation of things, right? Project.json you can think of as, that's like a definition of your project. It's a set of things you depend on, the commands that you use to run things. That's used when you're building. Like you're going to build, how the loader goes through and figures out what all the dependencies are and how to load them and what to build. Your web.config file is like runtime configuration data, name value pairs that your system uses. Web.config we think of as just another source of config data that the new config system can read from. The new config system can read from environment variables, a random JSON file, XML, your web.config file, sure. You can read from wherever you want. You can plug in your own providers. So web.config as a config source, you either may be supported out of the box, still to be determined, but you'll probably also be able to, you could wire one up a provider yourself to read from web.config if that suits your needs. Will the command line app auto recompile too? So you'll notice that the way the command line app worked, it was actually just a script, and the actual executable was that klr.exe. That's the CLR host. So this is a slightly different model than like compiling everything down to an exe. In this case, you're basically just running a script that's going to run an existing executable with the CLR host that then runs through a bunch of hosting layers to find the DLL that it needs to load, call main, on that DLL and start up the application. So you're not really recompiling the exe, but you are compiling all the dependencies for the application. And yes, that can work whether you're in VS or whether you're dealing with IIS, or whether you're dealing with like a command line self-hosted executable application and coding in your own favorite text editor. I know we got time for questions. I just want to make sure we get a couple more slides in. For the ODAV4 work, be sure to try out the samples. They're available on the ASP NET Coplex site. The nice suite of ODAV4 samples. And then lastly, like I said, this is early, so please join us in this effort. Check out the code on GitHub, ASP.NET Home. There's instructions on how to build, instructions on how to try out the MyGet feeds. We welcome contributions. We welcome your feedback. File issues in our issue tracker. Join us on in the Jabber chat rooms or in the forums. We'd love to hear from you. And I'll be hanging out in the Project K chat rooms to answer questions for any questions that I wasn't able to get to here. Looks like I got 3 more minutes left, so let's answer 1 or 2 more. Is Web Deploy or MS Deploy the preferred deployment technology for MVC6? We're still leveraging MS Deploy based deployment for deploying to Azure and so forth. There'll probably be some enhancements that we'll do on top of that technology, because we envision things like, well, if you have a cloud optimized app with a bunch of dependencies, and you're deploying into an environment that already has some of those dependencies available, wouldn't it be nice if there could be some negotiation that occurs where you say, I'm using MVC6. Oh, well, the server says, I've already got MVC6 in this environment, so no need to bring it with you. We've already got it. And then you can go up with just a set of stuff that's actually needed, save on bandwidth, save on time. So there will be some deployment enhancements definitely on top of it, but we're still leveraging MS Deploy and Web Deploy based technologies. Can the auto-contained app you mentioned be hosted in a Linux environment? So one thing I didn't talk about is support for cross-plat. If you want to hear all about cross-plat, probably want to tune into the ASP.NET vNext session later today. But just high level, the ASP.NET vNext will be supported on both a Windows machine, like I've got here, and on non-Windows platforms. Like if you have a Mac and you want to do development on the Mac, sure, no problem. If you want to then deploy your ASP.NET vNext app to a Linux VM hosted on Azure, that's totally fine too. Now, there are pieces, of course, that are coupled to Windows just from a technology standpoint, like our web listener that I was using to host that application locally in its own process. That's all based on HBSys. Well, there's no HBSys on my Mac or my Linux machine, so you need some other server that you can sit on top of. So the app that I had as is would need another server that it could sit on top of to run on a Mac, but that's certainly doable, and we've had prototypes that have done that, and we plan to have support for that story. Last question. Where can we give feedback and join the discussion during this critical early stage? There's a contribution guidance on our GitHub project, but places where you can directly fire feedback into the product, like if you find bugs or have feature suggestions, would be in our GitHub issue trackers. So github.com/ASP.NET/home. And then you can find the right issue tracker for the component you care about, file issues there. If you want to have more of a discussion with us, then I recommend going to ASP.NET vNext forum on the ASP.NET site. So go to the ASP.NET and look at the forums and go to the ASP.NET vNext forum. Or if you want to have more like a real-time conversation, feel free to join us on Jabber in the Jabber chat rooms. And with that, I'm out of time. Thanks for joining today, and hope you enjoy MVC6.